Hello and welcome to our weekly Integral Love Relationship Web Jam. My name is Martin Utschig and I'm the author of Integral Relationships, a Manual for Men, and my new book, Sex, Purpose, Love, Couples in Integral Relationships Creating a Better World. And today I'm honored and excited and curious to welcome Dr. Mark Forman to our Web Jam.
Hi, Martin.
Mark. Thank you for being on time and online with your butt. So it's going to sound great today.
You're welcome. Totally my pleasure.
Yeah. So please participate by typing in your name and where you join us from on the right bottom side of your screen. And there you can also enter your questions for Mark and me and your comments. If you are single and brave enough and looking for a partner, you can also put in your integralsingles.com profile name or your Facebook profile name. And you can also join our conversation live by clicking on the hand symbol on the top right of your screen. And once I accept your request, a small plugin will be downloaded to test your camera and your microphone. And then you can come online and share your questions and comment that way. Please know that this web jam is recorded and you give your permission to be included into the replay. Welcome, Tom from Carlsbad. Tom will be a guest in June, I think. So looking forward to that. Another integral PhD therapist. And I want to introduce Mark. Dr. Mark Forman is the author of the really excellent book, Integral Psychotherapy. Usually when I have a guest, of course, I read their book and I can usually skim a book kind of like during the week, but it was so interesting and so inspiring and I mean, so many new aspects in that book that I admit I only made it halfway through, and I will make a big effort, or I will read the whole book. It's so interesting. And I told Mark previously, on one side, I'm sad that I didn't read the book before I wrote my own book. And on the other side, I was glad that I didn't read it, because I probably would have added another 100 pages to my latest book. So wonderful book. Mark is as I said, the author of the book Integral Psychotherapy, which I will show you an image shortly. And he provides psychotherapy in San Jose in person and online for clients throughout California. That's the licensing thing, right? The therapist thing. And then you also provide developmental counseling online for individual adults worldwide. So no matter where you call us from, you can, and you want to consult with Mark, you can do that. He is also the founder and lead trainer of the Certified Integral Psychotherapist, CIT for short, global training program, and actively teaches and supervises both therapists and coaches interested in the direct application of integral theory to psychotherapy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Later this year, and that's what he's working on right now, Mark will release a self-guided audio course that will help you assess your own state of development. Wow. Often get this question, when people learn about stages of development, how can I find out at what stage am I? And in my case, often my partner, right? Because one of the things that I maintain is that when relationship conflicts emerge and people are at different levels of consciousness, it's very often very hard to bridge them. And so this will be a great tool, I guess, to do an assessment. Wonderful. And you can find more information about Mark at Dr. Mark Forman. So that's DrMarkForman.com. And at citintegral.com. And I will paste that into the comment line on the right side shortly. Well, actually, I need to do it now. So I'll do that real quick. For those who are with us online, there it is. So I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
I was really looking forward to this. So, and I'm quickly opening a PowerPoint, just a few slides to have a visual here. So this is the cover of your book, A Guide to Integral Psychotherapy, Complexity, Integration, and Spirituality in Practice. And my question is, there are so many, this is from WebMD, surprising health benefits of being in a healthy love relationship, like fewer doctor visits, less depression, lower blood pressure, less anxiety, natural pain control, better stress management, fewer colds, faster healing, longer life, up to 7 years statistically, happier life. We also know that people in healthy relationships are financially better off, have more stability in their jobs, make more money. I mean, there's like, I say, if we could sell the benefits of being in a healthy love relationship in a pill, that we would be gazillionaires. Everybody would want that. And yet, I observe working in that field that a lot of specifically more highly developed people often struggle with being in a relationship or don't want to be in a relationship at all. They're more focused on becoming whole and complete in themselves, or have all kinds of other ideas. And there are probably many reasons for why people struggle of being in a healthy relationship. But today, I have these 4 curious questions. How do spiritual bypassing, which is a big topic, contribute to that fact that a lot of people cannot be, don't want to develop the skills to be in a relationship? Then another topic that's really dear to me, and I really only discovered that when I wrote my second book, or I discovered it to the relationships I had between the first book and the second book, about personality disorders, specifically borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic, which I'm not a therapist, so I went into these relationships having no idea, what would come towards me when I found out about that. Then attachment theory, which is another thing I had spaced, and then I found this book, Attached, which is a great book in my opinion. And I personally found out that I'm fairly secure attached when I'm in, not challenged too much, but when I'm challenged in the relationship, that I'm kind of like moving to the anxious side. And so when I was with someone who moved more to the avoidant side, right, and there was this. So that was really a big insight for me. And then, of course, what you cover extensively in your book is the unconscious, and you list 3 forms of the unconscious, and what we usually refer to as shadow, and then emergent and embedded unconscious. So just also to give people an idea how complex and deep your book is in the quadrants and the levels and 3 forms of the unconscious. So, big breath, right?
Big breath. Yes. Where should we start?
And just to get it all out, now is, I also noticed, and that is of course very self-selective from specifically the men who contact me, but I often noticed in my own life, and also in men integral men, often very evolved men, contacting me, that we feel attracted to women who are complex, right? So of course we're attracted to sexy women like most men, but then also we're attracted to women who have a spiritual practice, who did some healing growth work, and that is very attractive, and the complexity of these women, I'll speak for me, is very attractive. But then I found out in my case, and also in case of quite a few integral men, that these women had personality disorders and challenges. And I'm sure that goes the other way around, right? That some women go like, well, I dated some men who then were really very interesting and attractive, but then it turned out they dealt with a lot of issues that were then, very hard to overcome. So another question then will be, how do we meet people who struggle, obviously, and suffer a lot because of that, with love and compassion and kindness, without getting sucked into that. So I know I threw a lot of stuff at all of us, but
so I think,
what are your initial thoughts when you look at this whole plethora of questions?
I think that one place to start on this discussion of integrally interested persons, or persons who are interested in development, and the people that they might meet and resonate with
Mhm.
is that it's my experience that in communities where people are very driven to developmental goals, and that could be the integral community, that could be spiritual communities, it could be therapeutic communities,
Mhm.
that there's probably a higher than average presence of attachment wounding and early developmental challenges in the sense of issues in the family, issues with parents, either one mother or father, or the
Mhm.
absence of one mother or father, addiction issues, etc.
Mhm.
And that part of the reason they or we, and I would include myself in this, show up in these developmental communities is that we're driven to make sense or to heal or to overcome
Mhm.
some of these early experiences. And so what that creates in integral language is a drive towards complexity, because what we experience is that complexity is a necessary component of healing or working with this early material. We need to be able to see ourselves from multiple perspectives in order to metabolize a difficult relationship with our father or mother.
Mhm.
It's not, or it's rarely as simple as you just sort of talk through the memory and then it all sits in place.
Mhm.
We really usually need to be doing practices. We need to be looking at it from many different points of view. So that sets up a really interesting dynamic when it gets to relationships,
Mhm.
because often if we're talking about people who are driven towards complexity, they then want a partner who mirrors them. And the research is pretty clear here that we're more drawn to partners who are similar to us, all things considered. There may be some differences for sure and dynamics that are different, but overall, we tend to want to match in our partners. And one of the things I think we do tend to want to match is developmental level.
Mhm.
So what you can sometimes get is two very complex persons
Mhm.
in a relationship. Now it may be from the man's point of view, the woman is more complex and challenging. It may be from the woman's point of view, the man is more complex and challenging.
Yes.
So, there are two sides to that story. But I think that that is typically what I have seen working with clients who are sort of in integral and being in sort of the integral community when it gathers and congeals in different places. So
Mhm.
that what I would say that sets up a lot of the challenge that I think we then kind of live out or see.
Mhm. So we talked about these four areas, right? I don't know if you see them. I mean, they're obviously connected, right? But the spiritual bypassing,
Yes.
personality disorder, attachment styles, and shadow issues. Uh,
Yes.
and of course, Ken Wilber says, the more we grow in consciousness, since there is always the process, as you describe in your book, of that we're identified with our stage, right? And then there is a process of differentiation, of transcending the limited views and integrating the next higher level, right? So there's this differentiation, and then the next higher level. And the more we go up through these stages, the more opportunities we have to screw up, as Ken says.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, is your audience, do you think, Martin, pretty familiar with the idea of spiritual bypass? Is that something that you
Yeah,
think
why don't
folks?
we start there before we go into the more complex?
Sure, yeah. So, spiritual bypass is just the idea that we can use spiritual beliefs or reference spiritual experiences as a way that can, as a way to avoid more difficult sort of worldly material. So relationships become avoided because it's not spiritual to, give yourself over to a relationship. It's spiritual to stay isolated and meditative, etc. It's not spiritual to develop your career. It's spiritual to, focus on the non-material things. Sexuality is a very big one. Sexuality obviously has a lot of baggage, even in the modern spiritual traditions. That's looked down upon. So we use our spirituality to step away from that. And that what we need to do, or what is healthiest to do, is to actually ground ourselves in our spirituality, but then use that added resilience and perspective taking that comes, and then move into these challenging areas of life. And I say they're challenging for everybody, whether we're on a developmental path or not.
Yeah.
And so it can be, and it's very common, that folks who are on a explicitly developmental path may use this spiritual bypassing and then not really attend to the parts of them that are about relationship. And then those parts, though, don't disappear just because we sort of push them away or sort of keep them unconscious. They find a way to emerge, and they show up often most powerfully in relationship. There's something about the container of relationship. My sense is because it hits on so many core feelings of validation, acceptance, potentially rejection, that it really charges up whatever sort of stored material we have from the past, or it really challenges our edges around growth in intimacy, which may be not so much always about the past. It's actually sort of a present time developmental need to be able to grow and mature in intimacy with a person. It's very challenging path to take.
Yeah. So other aspects that come to mind around spiritual bypassing. First of all, on sexuality, I also saw the other way that sexuality is seen as something isolated outside of a committed relationship, as part of a spiritual practice. So like Tantra, right? Would you say that's also so like a form of spiritual bypassing? Or this,
in other words,
one taste movement, right, where people meet and just have sort of like, non-intercourse sexual interactions, but they're not in the context of a committed relationship.
Yes. And I, working in the Bay Area as a therapist, as I do, I see quite a bit of that, or I hear about it quite a bit from my clients. And for a lot of them, they have some of this early wounding, and often these things can be a developmental aspect. So they're a chance to explore sexuality a little bit outside the context of relationship. But I would say it's a much more incomplete process to have the sexuality integrated into a loving romantic relationship, day-to-day life partnership, is a more well-rounded, and I often want to see my clients moving in that direction over the long term. If they do choose to explore some of the emerging forms of sort of sexuality outside of that container. Yes.
And then there is like, for me, the classic in The Power of Now with Eckhart Tolle, which was my spiritual path for 6 years, starting in 2000, where he says, you don't need psychotherapy. All you need is to stay present with whatever emotion arises.
So that may be, I have never seen that to be true,
Mm-hmm.
is what I would say. It sounds great on paper, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to preclude the idea that there are some people who just, need to stay present, and their sort of psychological life is either so healthy or so relatively simple and
Mm-hmm.
straightforward that they just need to stay present and everything falls into place.
Yes.
I have never actually met that person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where he or she is. Maybe it's Eckhart
Yeah.
Tolle, and that's it. What I really see is, the future of spiritual teaching. Here's how one way to put it: the
Mm-hmm.
future of spiritual teaching contains psychotherapy, and
Mm-hmm.
the future of psychotherapy contains spiritual teaching. And
That's
that we're going to look back, at this period and see that this was the last period where those professions were completely separated. And
mm-hmm.
I would say, if you look at current conferences in psychotherapy, there's a real emphasis, and there has been, on the inclusion of mindfulness. Spirituality is really being recognized as much more important.
Mm-hmm.
And my take of watching a lot of spiritual teachers is that they are incorporating through the cultural waters a lot of therapeutic ideas and concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So I really see them as a future field that will be hybridized,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, because the nature of us as people is that we need both things, and there's a constant dialectic between those two ways or lenses, between the
Mm-hmm.
spiritual lens and psychotherapeutic or psychological lens.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, how that was for me when I read this and then opened up to deeper relationships and, separated from my wife. And then, and then a lot of painful emotions came up in different contexts. And I thought, oh, I just going to stay present with it. Here is the painful emotion. But after months and months of these painful
Mm-hmm.
emotions that I was observing, I went like, there must be another way of, like, they're not going away. It's actually getting worse in a way, right?
Yes.
So I just no longer had it in me to spiritually bypass it. It completely paralyzed me in a way, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then I started to see a therapist and saw, that there is a lot of value in it to integrate it as well. Uh, and then there is maybe finally, so like a pet peeve I think that most integral people have is this non-judgmentalism, right? That we shouldn't be judgmental. Does that
Mm-hmm.
for you also fall into the realm of spiritual bypassing?
Can you say a
And
little bit?
everything that's associated with it.
Sure. Can you say a little bit more about where you're coming from in the concept of non-judgmentalism? I just want to hear a bit about that.
Well, if somebody's emotionally abusive or just not a
Mm-hmm.
functional person, right? And then of course now we could argue forever what is a functional person, but when then somebody says, "Oh, you shouldn't have a judgment towards this person because he or she, doesn't pursue work or cannot
Mm-hmm.
sustain her," or just whenever you say something uh, negative about another person, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
or what's the right word, right? That then you get immediate this pushback. Oh, I'm non-judgmental. I don't judge other people for their behavior. And
Yeah.
then, of course, in a relationship, I mean, when you take that to the end, then you could say, well, your partner can do whatever they like, right? Like beat you, waste all your money, lie, cheat on you. And you say, well, I'm not judgmental, I'm
Mm-hmm.
everything is, that's just, I'm being present. I accept everything as it is.
This would be, I mean, I see that in clients in a more general way, the non-judgmentalism.
Mm,
But usually when I see it in a client who's having a relationship where there are difficulties, it doesn't show up often that consciously.
mm,
Like, I'm going to look at my partner and say, this person is emotionally abusive, but I can't judge, or or sort of actually saying that. It's more that the person, usually with the spiritual practice, has unconscious ways of tolerating and sort of forbearing through very difficult relationship circumstances. So they're sort of ways of managing, surviving, renegotiating that often can be just in them. And then they're holding maybe a difficult partner, and they're doing this kind of extra work that they don't even see they're doing. And so that can then stretch out and then lead to bad, either really toxic relationships or very bad endings.
Yeah.
So often the work is less about, well, why aren't you judging? It's more like trying to unearth the suffering that is happening, if it's happening, and say, isn't this interesting that you're tolerating this much? I wonder where that comes from.
Yeah.
And then that often leads to a contemplation of how the person got there.
Yeah.
So it's a more subtle form of not judging that I see. Does that make sense?
Some sense. So
Some sense, yeah.
So for me, in that, my hardcore spiritual phase, and until recently, I felt like, I'm seeing myself, self-image false probably, this awakened man who can love undefendedly. There's this great book, Undefended Love, right? So if my partner does something that creates an emotional reaction inside of me, which can be pretty strong, I should not judge her behavior, but I should see, where is that coming from in me, and not have a judgment towards her in my case.
Yes.
Right. And I realized that there is probably some behavior, right, that people through that, I think that's related to spiritual bypassing, then accept real abusive behavior, specifically if there's a pre-trans fallacy, a green person dating a red person sort of being the classic example, and where we then beat ourselves up for not being able to accept our partner, where a third person perspective might say, well, yeah, that's really unacceptable behavior. It doesn't create more, doesn't really support creating a healthy relationship. Does that make sense?
It does. And reflecting on what you're saying, when people are in that much of a space, if they're really in an abusive relationship and they're consciously saying to themselves, well, I can't judge my partner's behavior, and as a spiritual sort of worldview, they usually are not going to come into therapy. They're not the clients that I see, because if there's no judgment and it's all relative, and the person is strongly in that space, they're not usually looking to break down and examine their points of view. When they come eventually to me in therapy, usually that has broken down and they're seeing that there are problems, but they're maintaining them in other ways, and they're confused. So there's a period of coming out of that in a relationship and then coming into the question. So I think I might be framing it more towards the people who would be showing up in my office in the midst of that difficult relationship and are ready to do a different kind of work, or ready to question a certain perspective that they've taken. So
I like that you said the word confused, because that's where I found myself.
Yeah.
Like, just to give an example, the last woman I dated, it was in Germany. So, she went out with a client of her who paid her 300 euros for a acoustic, very expensive dinner, which he also paid once a week. And, I was sitting alone at home, getting totally triggered that she goes out with this other guy who pays her. And I was so confused, because I knew it was triggering a deep wound inside of me, which I couldn't really get in touch with. And on the other side, my mind said there is really something wrong that I fly to Germany to be with her, and she gets paid by someone, right, to to go out to dinner once. And she just said, well, there is no sex, and hey, we can spend the money. Why not take it, right? And I was so confused because I could not separate really, what's externally maybe wrong about this, or is that okay, and my own inner wound, right?
Yeah,
about my strong emotional reaction to that.
And it's for people who are into Integral, it's very interesting to think about that. So there's the stage of development that you're embedded in, meaning that's where your center of gravity is. And that aspect of you has a complex perspective and is thinking, is this right? This doesn't seem right that this should be going on, or is it? And there's a lot of questioning and perspective taking.
Right.
But the part of us that gets attached in a relationship is better conceptualized as a younger part. And that younger part feels connected and joined, or feels acceptance from the other person. And so it's never so easy as to just say, well, I don't accept this behavior and then goodbye. We have to work with that dialectic in ourselves between our wisest or highest functioning developed self and the earlier attachment parts, and see if we can get them to form a healthy relationship. So a healthy relationship, the healthiest kind, is when the sort of center of gravity is working with the attachment parts, and there's a kind of smoother communication between those parts. And that is something that can be very difficult if there's attachment wounding, and if we haven't looked specifically at the relational part. So if we're going to think about ourselves as taking up 20, 30-year practices, to develop ourselves meditative, body, intellectually, I think we should be taking time explicitly at some points to develop the relational and to look into our attachment histories and how we join or mesh or interdepend with people, because it will come up.
Dr. Tom Habib, who I mentioned earlier,
Hi, Tom.
another therapist, integral therapist, says, hello, Mark, you wrote about encapsulated identities in A Guide to Integral Psychotherapy. Do you find that intimate relationships are really good at surfacing these unconscious identities? And as they arise, they set off upper right, which is the physical body, hormones, physical reactions, psychological reactions.
Yes. So encapsulated identities is just the same idea that we have parts of ourselves from earlier stages that sort of remain as they are, and under pressure, we sort of those parts sort of float up and take over our identity. So we've had a very stressful day at work. We can't seem to get some things done. Somebody cuts us off when we're driving home on the road. All of a sudden, this young, angry part just overtakes us and we're furious. So our defenses have been sort of worn down, and that encapsulated identity kind of comes up and if you like, hijacks our identity for a bit. I think that in relationships is the place where we see this kind of hijacking most consistently, for a couple of reasons. One is that your partner, if you're close with them and intimate with them and open, you are vulnerable. And so what they say or do has a deeper effect, so can pull you into those parts more easily. That's not bad. It's just the nature of relationship. Your partner can look at you a little bit sideways, and that can be enough to make you wonder. Of course, what we're doing when we're growing is we're trying to work with that and notice, okay, am I just projecting? Is this really what I think it is or fear it is? And so we try to communicate into those moments of triggering. And that's part of how we grow in a relationship. The other part is if we're just around people long enough, we're going to see that triggering and it's going to come up because closeness it kind of exposes us. So when we live with somebody or get to know them very well, they are going to see our parts. And that's part of the process of deeper intimacy. So yes, these triggered encapsulated parts come up. There's big physiological reactions of anger or fear or whatever our tendency is. And I think that's part of the edge and growth mechanism in intimate partnerships.
Yeah, when I was in this situation, I had I had other strong physical reactions, but in that particular case, my whole inner self was like vibrating and shaking. Something really deep must have been touched there. So, that the physical reaction was just like amazing, in the upper right body, physical body.
Do you remember what the trigger was?
Well, the trigger was, as I said, that she went out with this other man who paid her basically, and obviously, I think had a crush on her, right? And was very wealthy, so maybe we don't want to go into the details, but maybe it was shame around money, not having enough money, or just not feeling good enough, or feeling rejected, or whatever it was. But it touched something really deep, and it's probably an ongoing exploration for me when that comes up again, what was very deep. And of course, the problem was also for me that she had no compassion, right? She said, it's not a big deal, right? It was totally like, there's no problem. I have no sex with him, so let's move on. And I said, no, I want to find out what's going on here and find a solution, right? That we can meet everybody's need. So just if we are in a relationship with somebody who has a tendency to spiritual bypassing, do you have a few tips how we can, obviously telling this person, oh, you're spiritual bypassing and you have to do this and this, doesn't help the relationship, right? They will, of course, then argue and say, oh, you're so judgmental, or you're not spiritual enough, right?
It tends to be that we don't listen very much to our intimate partners, in their perspective of us, even if they're correct. And I try to stay away in intimate relationships from putting on my therapist hat and coming up with therapeutic interpretations, but certainly more than once I have heard the feedback of hearing a partner say, I went to therapy and I just discovered this, and having me say, I told you that 6 months ago, or something like that. And it's not just me. That's the experience that we have in love relationships. It's often the ones we have in family, where we can see what the person is struggling with. We can say what it is. And yet it's not really our role, and the person, we all filter that out to a certain extent. I think that we want our close ones to love us more than analyze us, and it's diminishing returns in the sense of how effective it is. It just isn't that. If you see a partner, doing spiritual bypassing or engaging in that, I think the best thing you can do is to try to love them well and try to sort of speak their love languages in the way that they speak them. And that's what you can do. And that can sometimes give people strength in order to maybe take what is a scary developmental step. So if someone's really bypassing, there's always something behind it, always
Yeah.
some fear or challenge that they would have to be exposed to inside themselves, or maybe sometimes steps in their outer life. So we want to support them to be the best people they can be. And that's about what we can do, other than taking a more drastic step and saying, there's an issue in the relationship and we've got to maybe get ourselves to couples therapy and work on it. I have not found that that people who, or I would say it like this, people who are spiritually bypassing and really don't see it and are not looking to change in their lives, there's very little we can do. So the best thing to do is to try to choose partners who have a willingness to look at themselves, and have some track record of self-reflecting. If you're with somebody who just has difficulty with that, it's a risk, because they may learn it during the course of your relationship, but they may not. Which
is the reason why I wrote my first book, because for a while I thought, why do people break up? Why can't they work out their differences? And then I had this big shift where I realized, no, why did they get together in the first place? When after a certain amount of time, it's so clear that they're incompatible. And so I wrote this, relationship manual for men, because I learned to interview women to just find out more upfront, right? Like, are they potentially spiritually bypassing? So time is flying. And I just want to say this term has been coined by John Welwood, who wrote The Journey of the Heart. I think really great, bunch of great books. But then Robert Augustus Masters, another great therapist, wrote sort of like a condensed version, great book called Spiritual Bypassing. So if that's an issue you deal with, these are two books that I highly recommend, the John Welwood books and Robert Augustus Masters, all of his books, actually. We have another question from Joe. My issue question is this: in all my reading in integral relationships, I hear that if the levels of the individuals in the relationship are 2 or 3 levels different, the answer is sorry. That's my line. Implying in the matrix that a relationship is doomed for failure. I'm hoping for another hopeful response, since I find myself in love with an amber red while I strive for teal second tier.
Okay.
So that's the classic, of course.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling about this is that we can have relationships with people across levels for certain. It depends on what we're expecting and wanting out of a relationship. So a relationship is many things, an intimate partnership. If we're looking for someone to resonate the complexity of our process with us, in that way, we do need someone who's developmentally similar. Otherwise, that aspect wouldn't work. But if we're looking for companionship and maybe a relationship that simplifies that, and if we wanted to say the person later in development is willing to get those needs met internally or through friendships or through their work in other with therapists, teachers, whatever they're doing, then there's no problem in having a relationship with somebody who may be at an earlier adult stage of development.
But here I just want to say adult stage of development, an earlier adult stage.
Yes. And I think, I have not written about this, but I've thought about this. I mean, really, once we're talking about amber or amber orange, we're talking about adult stages. Those are stages which we can see adults inhabit those stages
in a healthy way.
Consider this is a functioning, healthy non-arrested development.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I tend to think of the line. So when clients come to me, if I'm just assessing their development, if someone is red and they're, past their late teens, that is usually something of a developmental arrest and it's concerning, and there's usually a lot of issues there. If someone is into amber orange, I am not making at all the judgment that this person needs necessarily to grow in stage of development. If they want to, often they do when they come to therapy, but it's not a pathology. So I would say that the span of adult development is amber, orange, then all the way through whatever the clear light. I think that's Ken's last one. But turquoise for most of us, is about where we're going to see, 99% of people are in that range. So that's what I would say to that question is, yes, it can work out. It's just based on expectations.
Yeah. I know a little bit about this relationship, and there is a lot of conflict and a lot of difficulties, and Joe, is integrally informed and integral man, and that, that's a ongoing discussion that I have, that people often contact me about, where they feel that there are 2-3 levels different in development. And maybe often they may admit, I'm not the most healthy integral person. And, but, there seems to be clearly these 2-3 levels of difference. And I'm still like at a loss basically to say, I usually say if there is no conflict in the relationship, and as you rightly said, right, if the needs of each partner, often in a limited way, are met and they can meet their other needs somewhere else, that can definitely work. I'm not saying these relationships cannot work. My dad was very orange. My mom was very mythic, conformist, but they were healthy in their development and they benefited from each other that way. But when strong conflicts emerge, I still observe that the communication, the validity claims. And next Saturday, by the way, we have Kim von Berg, who's a communication expert. And so we talk a little bit about how people at different levels communicate differently, right? Justify their worldview and their actions in a very different way, in a less complex or in a more complex way. And then usually I'm at a loss as, if people ask me for advice, what to do. So that's what Joe asking,
Yeah, and I would support that point if we're in a sort of talking or thinking in a kind of statistical way or thinking about probabilities. I would say, generally our safest move is to join with somebody or become in relationship with somebody who's closest to us developmentally, but that it's possible, and there's a depends, and there's exceptions to everything. But I would say if someone were saying, just shoot for your best bet, I would say, it's very helpful when the two people in a relationship are using similar structures, psychological structures of thinking to work through issues or to communicate. It's a nice resonance to have, and it's a nice form of mirroring, because you're more apt to look at the same thing, more apt to see like the same situation from different points of view rather than just completely different situations, which sometimes can happen. So,
Of course, once you're married and have little children and things, and then you find out that you're 3 or 4 stages apart, one's sort of like the, what is that? the
rose-colored glasses come off.
Can
Yeah.
come off, yeah, when the I'm losing the word right now, senior moment, the romance phase is over, right? And the infatuation phase, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Over. Then, yeah, I probably afraid we don't find the silver bullet, for overcoming the problems with couples who find themselves in different stages of development after the romance phase kind of like wears off, and specifically when the children are already in the picture and things like that. It's heartbreaking,
Very difficult. I think, we need, as a society, as a culture, as psychology, spirituality, and these ideas penetrate the culture a bit more, I think people have more of a sense that they need to choose compatible partners. So I've had many young couples come to me in the last, 5-7 years who say, we're going to get married. We want to do some counseling to talk about the issues. So I think there's an idea that's seeping in, although I would say I'm in the Bay Area, and so we're very progressive. So it's going to start here. But there's ideas seeping in that relationships have an element that is work. And that it's not enough to have a fantastic honeymoon period. People are starting to really hear that message. And I think, implicit in that is choosing someone you can communicate with, and that implies something about developmental similarity. So at least that's my hopeful take, that might be making better choices of partners for ourselves, and less likely to end up with then 3 kids and then,
then find out. So Liz was saying, I think this is probably one of the most important characteristics to look for in a partner. The willingness. Oh, she said willingness. I think this is probably one of the important factors. And Deborah speaks my mind. I'm hoping we will have time to talk about the disorders, attachment, and the 3 unconscious. And I would briefly like to go to attachment.
Sure.
And let me see if I can start this presentation again real quick. So just one more slide. So could you say briefly, do you see the slide, Mark?
I do, yes.
Can you say something about this?
So I would say, I think this looks like a very nifty slide. Let me not completely try to follow this, because I've never worked with this slide. But essentially, there's 3 types of attachment, if we want to simplify it. There's being securely attached,
which is in the top left.
Top left, which means being comfortable with closeness, but then also being comfortable with independence in relationships. The partner decides to go do something for themselves or with other people. We don't easily get threatened, but nor is it overwhelming to get very close to somebody. So that's secure attachment, and we're all looking to develop that secure attachment. And as far as we can tell, it can be developed for those of us who don't have it, if we enter into healthy relationships and then learn to rethink or re-narrate our stories of how we arrived at our lack of secure attachment. So there's a recovery process that can happen. So the secure is good with closeness, good with independence. The anxiously attached.
May I just chime in for a second? So they show this here. I know this is always complex if you look at it first, but you have a low avoidance of relationships. And you have low anxiety about left. So that leads to the secure attachment. And of course, that's a continuum, right, of, how low your avoidance is and how low your anxiety is.
I see.
So it's not a black and white thing. Okay, next.
So then if we move over to the right, low avoidance and high anxiety, that's the anxiously attached. So the partner who tends to cling more to the relationship and gets nervous if the other partner is independent or withdraws. So it's a kind of it's a very leaned in position. I sometimes talk about this as like oceans and shores. So the ocean is the anxiously attached partner who constantly is sort of moving towards
the shore.
yeah, moving towards the other one. And so there is the high anxiety and the low avoidance. And then usually I then think of just the avoidant type as one thing, although it can be separated into two, which is the avoidant person is capable of intimacy in shorter bursts, but then they tend to move away and they have trouble maintaining closeness and they want to stay independent. And, you know, in the more intense cases of avoidance, they just have a lot of trouble with commitment, a lot of trouble with feeling engulfed in relationships.
Yes.
Maybe you want to say something about the anxious avoidant. You want to add something about that type, Martin?
Yes, and I often found that somewhat. I mean, I'm a lay person, right? But often, so like associated with what I read about personality disorders is people who have like a deep sense of need for safety and closeness and acceptance. But on the other side, once they kind of get it, they go in a total panic of losing it, and then they send these signals like, you know, they pull back, and so there is this. So like you can figure out, you know, they're anxious for a few days or weeks, you know, and then they're totally avoidant again, and it's like this back and forth that really wears. So there's no consistency of being avoidant or anxious, but it goes back and forth over, you know, and very extreme, right? Like I have to go away for 3 weeks to find myself. And then I have to be 3 weeks totally enmeshed with you. And then we have to be joined at a hip. There's this back and forth.
So sometimes therapists and the psychological literature talks about a fourth kind of attachment, and it's called disorganized attachment. Yes. And that is what you just said, which is that there's not a consistent pattern. It can be avoidant, the person can be clinging, sometimes they can look secure, but they just sort of cycle through. And what we know is that the disorganized attachment pattern only seems to be the result of a traumatic childhood.
Yes.
So if we see children coming from abusive or neglectful, emotionally, physically, sexually abusive, or emotionally neglectful households, or households where parents have mental illness or addiction, or there's other kinds of traumas, this disorganized attachment pattern can develop. And when I'm working with clients, I see a lot who have disorganized attachment because they are more likely to end up in therapy. Part of the work is seeing that they can move into all these positions, different attachment things. And just to really highlight this, I know we're coming to the end. You know,
we
as
can go
we're
a few minutes over if you're available.
Sure. Yes, I am. So these attachment patterns don't tend to grow as we're growing. So that can be one thing that's confusing. We can be moving up in stages of development, but our attachment patterns are, if we're not working on them, pretty much stay where they are. Yes. So that can be the confusing thing, in that your center of gravity really is common distance, but then you get into a relationship which triggers some of this stuff and you see, whoa, there's a large part of me that is still kind of down here and unrecovered. Yeah. And so sometimes practitioners see that they've got disorganized attachment, even if they're functioning well in the world. So that's quite a surprise. Sometimes the shock is pretty intense.
Yeah. So as long as they're single, right, that everything looks perfectly fine, and they can be very attractive. And then as soon as the pattern only shows up in intimate relationship, really.
Yep,
Right?
exactly.
And that probably ties back to what we started with, that they often then have done a lot of spiritual and psychological and personal growth work and have 25 certifications on the wall about trainings that they did, right? And haven't had a long-term healthy relationship in their life.
Yeah.
But really want it deeply, right? And on the other side are deeply afraid of it. And then they meet an integral man and they feel like finally or an integral woman, right? I mean, I'm so biased being a man and only dating women, but meeting an integral person and feel for the first time that there is somebody who can hold this wide range of complexity that they feel that they have, and often think this is actually quite healthy to, spend a few weeks alone and then go back in, this back and forth, which, other people may not, or, I wouldn't consider to be healthy.
Yeah. And just to say something about the topic of personality disorder, since we didn't touch so much on that, one way to think about a personality disorder is that these encapsulated identities, instead of being just temporary visitors, have early on in the person's life sort of taken over and kind of penetrated their viewpoint, so that it's constantly got a level of distortion to it. And that's a more serious case. So somebody with a personality disorder has a whole way of seeing the world that is influenced by these early parts, and they can be changed if the person is conscious that, or eventually has the conscious recognition that they have some of these personality tendencies. Probably the ones we talk about most are borderline and narcissistic. But it really relies on the person having some difficult moments of self-insight and then really working on a path to recover. If we get into a relationship with somebody who we think has a personality disorder and there's no recognition, it is not a good situation, and usually it's something we need to find our way out of, because it's like being in relationship with somebody who's an addict but refusing to acknowledge an addictive behavior. It just will not change on its own.
Yeah. And this is so hard, I mean, I'm just feeling the pain right now, right, of loving someone and enjoying so many aspects of the relationship, but then just burning out of always having to be sort of like the person who gives in and supports and puts up with what the other person perceives as normal, and often gets affirmed from other people who say, no, you're a wonderful person, right? But they only know them outside the context of the relationship. So like in the public sphere, right, where they usually show up as a, healthy, interesting, whatever, a great person. And it's really difficult. Michael says, brilliant and useful insights on this graph, but hard to navigate around these personality disorders in real life. Would be great to have a follow-up session on how to, after you laid out the basics so nicely. Thanks. Yes, of course, this is impossible to cover in an hour or even in 10 hours. So a few comments on, if you go to my website, integralrelationship.com, under blog for today's session, there are links to a test that you can do, which is from the book Attached, about your attachment style. And there's also, it's kind of interesting, 22 steps that relationships with people who have personalities or disorders go through. I don't know how scientific ultimately that is, but it deeply resonated with me and with some other people. And of course, the overall message is not to get into relationships like that in the first place, if you can help it. And specifically, if we're not therapists, or in my case, right, I just didn't know that these things that exist. So this is also why I was looking forward to this session to get my insight more in, and maybe that's the last question before we close a little late is obviously these are human beings that we fell in love with and we care a lot and we love, and then, as you said, right, you have to find a way to get out of them. Do you have any words of wisdom how we can hold this deep inner conflict? I think that Joe and others experience, right, of this, because often when we then try to get out of the relationship, the partner then shows their best sides of themselves, right, in order, and then as soon as we move back in and say, okay, we'll try one more time, then they go back to their, not so appealing behavior, to put it mildly. And then we find ourselves in this conflict of years and years probably of suffering.
I love Roger Walsh's distinction between a knowledge question and a wisdom question. So a knowledge question is the sky blue? Does maybe my partner have a personality disorder? There's a sort of one-time answer to that. And Roger says that a wisdom question is something we have to ask over and over again every day, which is, am I making the right choice today for myself? And in relationships, it's a lot of wisdom questions in that we're checking in. And when we're in difficult relationships, we have to ask. And what a previous participant, I think it might have been Liz, said, is that we're looking at willingness, our own willingness. So we're doing a self-take. How is my willingness today, or where I am, to hold for some of these difficult behaviors? Do I feel like I'm getting enough of what I need in order to continue? And then what is my partner's willingness? And often that's the real inquiry when we have a challenging partner, is, can I see their willingness to recognize that there are issues and to put some work into it, or do they deflect or bypass or avoid? And I would say, if you have a partner who's not willing, repetitively not willing, not just today, but today, next week, the week after, the month after, there's very little that you can do. And that's a very tough realization, but that when the problems start to surface, those are the questions you want to ask. And, in your case, Martin, the story you were telling, the question is, can, this woman who's going out with other men in some fashion, if you pointed that out to her, that was a hard situation, would she be able to see it? And would she take or try to correct it? And you just shook your head immediately. No. So there's a situation where you might be willing to help work with her as she's growing, but she's not willing to do the work. There is very little that can be done.
And just to be clear, I didn't absolutely say you should or could not do that, but I wanted to get together with her, kind of look, how we can find a way that I can find out where is my emotional reaction coming from that I own, and how can we, have empathy or find a way that this is more agreeable for both of us. And that was just not possible. I just used that as one example, specifically also because I had this deep physical reaction to it, which was interesting, in the upper right, body shaking and things like that. So Birgit said what Liz says, willingness, and she's seconding exactly what you just said. So I learned something today, willingness. I think this is a really great advice that maybe I never saw so clearly myself. Willingness, actually, I think there are some kind of determination or fate to meet certain people. Actually, I think there also is some kind of determination or fate to meet certain people. I mean, these relationships are all great growth opportunities, and I would have never written my 2 books. If on Facebook somebody yesterday asked, how do you deal, with the pain or the agony after a breakup, and I said, well, I stayed present with the pain, and I wrote 2 books. So, so that was my way of dealing and learning with it. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for your time and the work you do, which I just think is brilliant. And obviously other therapists are looking towards you and your work and the training you offer. And again, the Dr. drmarkforman.com and citintegral.com are your 2 websites. I mean, if you Google Mark Forman, you come up very high in the list. So obviously you can continue that conversation in person with Dr. Mark by contacting him and maybe work with him if you found that helpful, which I'm sure most people did. And also my heart goes out to everyone out there who struggles with difficult relationships, and hopefully both of you, if you're in a relationship, can find the right therapist. Because also what went through my mind, just to close this up, and I often say that when I coach, right, it's also really important to find the right therapist. And that became more clear after I read most of your book, how important it is to, I often joke and say, well, there's an amber person, and an orange person going to a green therapist, and then these 3 try to work out, their difficulties, and that's also an important aspect. And we will have Dr. Tom Habib on the show, and there's a few other integral therapists. So we went a little bit
pleasure,
over.
Martin. Really appreciated having the conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, and you all have a good weekend, and hopefully see you next Saturday, where we, in a way, go, around communication in relationships. So that was a good setup for the topic. And then next Saturday evening, I'm going to fly to Turkey for a 5-day training, which I'm really looking forward to. So if you're in Europe and have the time and the money, we still have a few spaces open there. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.